Welcome. Welcome. Welcome to the Cherokee Garden Library Fall Lecture. I'm Elise Drake, Chair of the Advisory Board, and I'm so glad you are joining us this evening. As many of you already know, the Cherokee Garden Library celebrated its 50th anniversary this year. Founded by the Cherokee Garden Club, the ever-growing collection is now well over 40,000 holdings, all firmly rooted at the Keenan Research Center and situated on 33 beautiful acres of the Gozueta Gardens in the Atlanta History Center. While we are proud of our collection of all things botanical, you, the Friends of the Library, are our most valued collection. Thank you for your ongoing interest and support. Tonight's program is made possible by the generosity of the McIntyre family. We are grateful for your thoughtfulness in establishing the Ashley Wright McIntyre Education and Programming Fund in memory of Ashley and her love of the natural world. What a beautiful legacy that gathers us together each year. To my knowledge, all previous programs have focused on topics above sea level. Tonight marks our first dive under the sea, which leads me to tonight's enthusiastic co-chairs, Adelaide Burton and Claire Reed. Thank you both for your brilliant idea to invite Dr. Walton to our campus. Thank you for your fun vision of a low-country oyster roast, the perfect change of pace following the lovely 50th celebration last spring. And now to introduce our speaker, please welcome Stacy Catron, the Cherokee Garden Library Senior Director. Thank you, Stacy, for your extraordinary leadership over the last 25 years.
I started it when I was 10. It is certainly my honor to introduce Dr. Bill Walton, and I love that when you meet him, he says, "Just call me Bill." Whether he's knee-deep in oyster beds or lecturing on the latest in clam cultivation, Dr. Bill Walton is a true seafood savant. Bill has a passion for all things shellfish, previously serving as a shellfish extension specialist at Woods Hole Sea Grant and as a professor at Auburn University. Now he's the ACUF Professor of Marine Science and Shellfish Aquaculture Program Coordinator at the prestigious Virginia Institute of Marine Science. His work is with farmers, managers, and organizations, and they're all tackling challenges and seizing opportunities in the world of shellfish aquaculture. His interests span the entire spectrum of this vital field, including exploring its potential for public fisheries and restoration efforts. He and his spouse, Beth, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us tonight, recently received the Frank Stitt Award for Industry Excellence by the Southbound Food Festival for their work with oyster farms across the southern U.S. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bill Walton.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So much pleasure.
Good. Well, thank you very much for having me and taking the risk of having a professor come and talk to you, and a science professor. I'm going to try to not tell you too much science, but tell you some stories. As the title said, I want to break that into 3 chapters for you. We're going to talk about oysters. A lot of people are fans of oysters. I'm going to talk a little bit about aquaculture and what that is. And then I'm going to talk about that idea of a revolution and what's changed here in the South. But before I do that, I do like to find out a little bit about my audience. So you can take out your phones with no shame. If you can zoom in on that QR code, the other way is you just text 22333 and you send that Bill Walton 073, or you go to that website, and you should be able to start entering a letter of what your favorite way is to have an oyster. This is just to find out. Grilled is a favorite. There is no shame in this. I have friends that don't eat oysters, so you can don't feel that I'll judge you. It is anonymous. I guess folks that come to a talk like this probably, there we go. There's always one in the crowd. All right, so let's find out a little bit more about some of your opinions here. And I hope this one now should, on your phone, you may have to refresh it. When you hear the term aquaculture, just type in a word or words that come to mind when you hear that phrase. Oh, there we go. Fish, that's pretty common. I was at Auburn University. Catfish are a big thing. Salmon, people think about that. I don't want to bias this. Yikes, that's fair. And I will say, like, as somebody who started, you'll hear a little bit of my story. As someone who started as a marine biologist, I had some hesitation about aquaculture too. And I'm going to show you how I learned to stop worrying and embrace shellfish aquaculture. But all right, Kimball House, seaweed, great. All right, last question here. When you hear the phrase or the term southern oysters, what do you think of? What words come to mind when you think of a southern oyster? Because this is where I want to talk a little bit about big, fried, Carolinas, dirty, less, wars, oyster wars. All right. That big part is one of the things I will say, certainly as someone who came from New England and moved down to the Gulf, I did not have a great impression of Gulf oysters. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but I thought of them as big and kind of muddy. And I will tell you that my opinion has changed quite a bit. All right, so Stacy was kind enough to give you this resume, but when you give a talk like this, you have to give some context for who you are. So these are the things I would put on my, what we call the curriculum vitae, your resume, your academic resume. I've done fisheries science. I have a degree in ecology and biology. I was a shellfish extension specialist working with folks on Cape Cod, and then I was a professor at Auburn University down on the Gulf Coast at the Dauphin Island Lab. I'm currently a professor at the VIMS, the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. I've been president of Aquaculture Society, and I was a clam cop. I actually had a badge, and I was a shellfish constable in the town of Wellfleet. And my wife and I had a small shellfish farm in Cape Cod Bay, and then when we moved down to the Gulf, we started a catered raw bar. So I've had my hands in and on shellfish for a while, but Stacy read my resume, so I'll give you something a little more personal. I have never once in a talk before shown my senior picture from the high school yearbook, but that's me. And down at the bottom, cut off there, is I put down marine biologist, career with oceans. So what did I do? I went off to school, and then I was like, all right, I'm going to be a professor. And I went to, from Tufts, I went off to Rutgers to get my master's, and then Maryland, and I wanted to think big. I wanted to think about these food webs and the complexities, and you can think about connectivity and all these things, and I know that sounds pretty professorial, academic. I found out that what I thought I loved, I really liked. In my research, I was lucky enough to end up on Martha's Vineyard off the coast of Cape Cod. And I found I'm going to tell you two love stories here because they're related. I fell in love with this woman, Beth Starr, who's now Beth Walton, and I started falling in love with shellfish aquaculture. And those stories go together because Beth worked at the Martha's Vineyard Shellfish Group, and that hatchery, by the way, they look pretty fancy, don't they? When you think about aquaculture, that might not be what you think of, a solar-powered hatchery perched on a pretty precarious pier, but that's what shellfish aquaculture looks like. They were growing, in this hatchery, growing millions and millions of clams and oysters and scallops. And they were doing that specifically not only for aquaculture, for people to use on their farms, but also for the town to put out to enhance the fisheries so that people that went out fishing could get more clams. I'm this bushy-tailed graduate student from Maryland, and I go up there and I'm interested in the European green crab. Now that's been there for 150 years at this point. But from a food web point of view, this did not grow up with this. And I was really interested in what did that mean. What I found was that over time, people like Beth, the people who ran the hatchery, people who ran the shellfish resources, certainly the shellfish, the harvesters, they didn't really care about food webs, and they didn't really care that the green crab was from Europe. They had a very basic applied question. If we put traps out and we trap this green crab, does it remove enough green crabs that we get more clams? And that was a very fundamental question, and I fell in love with doing science that somebody would use in a practical way. But also, I started getting my first taste of what it was like to produce shellfish and watch them grow and to see what they could do in the environment. So that was the beginning of the love affair. She lured me, that's Beth, she lured me up to down East Maine, so we were almost in Canada there. And at this hatchery, again, pretty fancy hatchery, this hatchery was the Beals Island hatchery, and they grew mostly soft-shell clams, and Beth would spawn those there and raise those. I was lucky enough to work at the University of Maine, Machias, and I got to start working with people who were harvesters, the clam diggers, who were thinking about, can I use aquaculture as something to supplement what we do? Is this something we can add to what we do? So I got to really start to learn about a different species and a whole different group of people and how they wanted to interact with aquaculture, what they wanted out of shellfish aquaculture. It's pretty cold up there, but we managed to find time to head down to the vineyard again. I proposed to her. Yes, that is a wampum engagement ring, and those are a plate of oysters. That's how I proposed to her. We got married on Martha's Vineyard. That's Jack Blake, an oyster farmer on Martha's Vineyard, who shucked his oysters at our wedding, and that cake is adorned with various shellfish. So there's a theme. We complicated that by adding these two during our Cape Cod era. And so from down East Maine, we moved back to Massachusetts, and I was out on Cape Cod. And the town of Wellfleet hired me as their clam cop, their shellfish constable. And that's where I got to learn another group of people and how they interact with shellfish. They were looking to do that for two reasons. They were trying to enhance the fisheries that they had, but there were also, Wellfleet is famous for its oysters, and those primarily come from private leases, or what we'd call shellfish farms. The town was growing shellfish, so this is where I started to get to grow hundreds of thousands of clams and oysters myself. After that gave me a few gray hairs, and I ended up working with the Cooperative Extension Service and ended up working with growers across southeastern Massachusetts. My wife worked at that little tiny building there is a shellfish hatchery at Mass Maritime Academy, so she was growing shellfish there. And that's the Boston Seafood Show. And the reason I put these pictures in, that's my son Cameron, who is on our shellfish farm in Cape Cod Bay, and he's holding a quahog. And I promise you, I remember this picture. Quinn was at his first shellfish aquaculture meeting, not by choice, as you can tell, but he was there. We've dragged him along on some of these shellfish adventures. With two boys, we were looking for a home, and we couldn't afford that on Cape Cod, and a job opportunity came up down on the Gulf Coast, working at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab for Auburn University. And there, this is the story I'll tell you when I get back to the oyster aquaculture revolution, I started working with people who wanted to grow oysters in the Gulf of Mexico. My wife worked in seafood marketing. Beth has done that. I mentioned the little raw bar that we had with our buddy Troy, so we got to do that. And for anyone who has kids, as excited as I am about shellfish, as excited as Beth is about them, we could never get these two little bastards to get excited about shellfish. We just talked to them about it, and they'd never be excited. I had to take them all the way over to Cedar Key, Florida, and that's Sean of Southern Cross Shellfish, showing them clam seed, which I've shown them 1,000,000 times. And look at their faces. They think it's the greatest thing ever. So it was still a joy to me as much as it galls me that they didn't react that way when we tried to do it. I should mention during that time, and I'll come back to this, that's when we started this sort of oyster aquaculture revolution, and that's when Oyster South started, which I'll get to. But then we moved, our parents are getting older. We moved back to Virginia to be closer to them, and I work at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, where Beth has continued as the executive director of Oyster South. I've got students, not only do I work with growers in Virginia, but we also work with growers still through the Southeast. So this is some of my folks working with some folks down at Spring Creek, Florida, working with, that's actually Kane and Greg sorting some oysters. And we still drag our boys on shellfish things. I thought of this as a vacation. I found out afterwards the boys didn't think of this as a vacation because we went to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, worked our way along the coast down to Wilmington and put them in the water helping these farmers put their stuff in. So we have brought them along, and maybe they'll end up in it. So I wanted to give you that background for where I have come from, somebody who was a scientist who thought of this very intellectually and somebody who's now made this a part of what I do. And I'm going to explain, I think, why, I don't know if you can explain love, but I'm going to try to explain how I've fallen in love with it. So let's start with the oyster. All right, I have to do this by law because I have a PhD. I have to give you some science here. So it is a molluscan bivalve. When you think of mollusks, that also includes snails. Snails are a form of mollusk. But bivalves are obviously, they have two shells, okay? Mussels, scallops, oysters. We have a handful of species of oysters in North America. Some say 5, but I think it could be a few more. But the oyster that probably most of us are familiar with are the eastern oyster, and the Latin name is Chrysostrea virginica. All right, that's our native eastern oyster. I do want to point out that oyster is tolerant enough. It has the ability to survive. Its range extends from the Canadian Maritimes down to the Yucatan Peninsula. That is the same species. So for those of you who are oyster lovers and have had raspberry points from Prince Edward Island or Wellfleets, and then you get some of this ones from North Carolina or from the Gulf, that is the same oyster. So all those different flavors, all those different varieties are because of where they're grown and how they're grown. They're also pretty amazing. They live in estuaries. You might not want to eat an oyster in nearly fresh water, but they live in estuaries almost down to fresh water. Full ocean salinity is about 35 parts per thousand. So remember the last time you were at the ocean and you got a mouthful of seawater and how salty that was? That's not 35% salt. That's 35 parts per thousand. That's how sensitive our tongues are to salt. 0, obviously fresh, but oysters can be at 5 parts per thousand. They can survive that. So my tongue, I can't really taste below about 14 parts per thousand. That's where I start to not taste salt anymore. And then the other fancy science terms for you are oysters live in what we call the subtidal, or below water, or the intertidal. So when you've gone to the beach and you see the part of the shore that comes in and out with the tide, they can survive that. And think about in the summer how hot it gets, or in the winter in Canada how cold it gets. They survive those temperatures. So a little more oyster biology. Fun facts, I guess I could have called this. So there are male and female oysters. But they are sequential hermaphrodites. So typically, oysters are born and they are males. And as they age and mature, smarten up, they become females. But they can switch back. That's possible. They're also not very romantic. For all that we hear about oysters as aphrodisiacs, they are what we call broadcast spawners. And this is sort of a very tough love approach to parenting, because what happens is they throw their gametes out into the water. So fertilization happens up in the water. That's not happening with the oysters. This is one reason you have oyster reefs or oyster beds, that when one oyster spawns, the others need to do that too, because you need to have the gametes in the same place for fertilization to happen. And then maybe most famously, they're filter feeders. So they help clear the water of that microscopic algae. So those are the single-celled, this isn't seaweed, these are the single-celled algae that are in the water. Okay. I'm going to try to convince you all to fall in love with oysters if you don't. And so other than eating them, I think that's one reason that you might like oysters, is they are delicious, whether they're raw or cooked. They're also, superfood is overused, but they are incredibly good for you. They're high in the good fats. They've got zinc. They're one of the best sources of zinc that you can get from eating food. So it is a food that I would argue is delicious. Beyond that, I think for a group like this, I didn't put the video up, but many of you have probably seen this video, where Chesapeake Bay water with oysters versus Chesapeake Bay water without oysters is considerably clearer. And I want to emphasize, it's important that when we harvest oysters that they come out of clean water. It doesn't matter if that water is green or clear. We have very strict rules about making sure that oysters are only allowed to be harvested out of waters that are safe to harvest from. We learned around New York City by 1900 or 1910, we learned that it's a bad idea to eat oysters out of New York Harbor because of human sewage. So we are very good and very strict about where you can harvest and grow oysters. All right? So when I think of this, I know people say cleaning, but I prefer clearing, because essentially what's happened is the oysters are like sheep in an overgrown pasture. A lot of our coastal waters are too green. We've put too many nutrients in them, too much fertilizer has gotten into that. That green takes off and blocks the sunlight. When we put oysters in there, or get oysters back there, then they can help graze that green down. And so for anybody that eats, a grazing animal, they are essentially grazers. All right. They also support jobs in rural coastal communities. So this is an aquaculture. This is wild fishery. These are tongers in Alabama. For those who go to Apalachicola, a pretty traditional way of doing this. Those are important jobs in those communities. And then if you're interested in sort of the big picture internationally, that the U.S. is, we have a seafood deficit, another thing for you to worry about. We have a seafood trade deficit, and so we bring in a lot more seafood than we export. And then culturally, a number of people go down to Apalachicola, I'm sure. And so if you've been there, they define themselves by that. If you don't know, there are a number of communities that do that sort of define themselves around the oyster or shellfish. Okay, so that's a little background about the oyster. Let me go to chapter 2 here for aquaculture, because we saw fish, we saw some concerns there. Let me show you what shellfish aquaculture looks like. So this is a couple research farms. That's the farm that I operate, and this is a breeding program at VIMS. But it's very typical of what an oyster farm would look like. You have containers in the water that are mesh containers that hold the oyster. I have to give you more definitions, sorry. I give lectures to students, so I can't help it. So if you wanted to really think about what aquaculture is, you're intervening at some point in the life cycle of a marine or freshwater organism. And you can do that with stocking, feeding, protection from predators, and whatnot. Has anybody been down to Apalachicola when they've been putting shell overboard? So that is technically, this is crazy, but that is technically aquaculture. They're putting shell overboard because they're trying to improve the grounds for oyster juveniles, what we call larvae, for them to find a better place. So we're intervening in their life cycle. It's a pretty primitive form of aquaculture, but it meets the definition. This modern aquaculture we call off-bottom oyster farming. For oysters, we protect it from predation, and we're doing regular stocking and handling. I'll show you some videos of that. But the main reason for having them there is that they're safe from things like crabs and fish, and they don't get washed away. Here's the nice thing about that. I can't feed these. I can't keep up with growing enough food for shellfish. They are relying on the food in the water, all right? The benefit of that is that, one, I can't overcrowd the area. I can't put too many oysters in an area. You can't, what we call, exceed the carrying capacity. For people, when you think about shrimp farming, you can get a lot of shrimp in a pond because you can exceed what nature would do by making sure you feed them a lot and then you put antibiotics in it. And you're sort of going past what nature would support there. You can't cheat in shellfish aquaculture because you're relying on what's there. But that also means I can't give them antibiotics. And there are times I wish I could, because sometimes oysters get sick, but you can't. That's just not possible. I've seen on the news, I've seen some concerns about the data center and the use of fresh water, and I think with climate change, we do have to think about potable water. And so when you think about how we produce animal protein and how much fresh water it's used to make a pound of chicken, versus shellfish use almost zero. I mean, we do wash some gear in fresh water, but they're not drinking it, and you're not typically using it. And I don't want to make fishermen bad guys. I think overfishing is overstated, but importantly, I think shellfish farming, oyster farming relies on what we call hatchery seed. They're not taking from nature or from the fishermen. They're producing those and adding them to the environment. So I really do think it is one of, if not the most sustainable forms of animal protein you can eat. And if we could get to the point that not only do we have beautiful oysters at restaurants on raw bars, but if we could have oysters where kids of the next generation are eating oyster nuggets, I would do it, because I think it's the right choice for the planet. I think unless you can get a bunch of people to be vegetarians, I think that we need to be thinking about how we can produce animal protein in a way that minimizes our footprint. So let me walk you through the steps for aquaculture production, and I'm going to start with nature, because shellfish aquaculture really isn't that different from what nature does. Shellfish aquaculture is just repeating that and then maximizing survival and growth. So what happens in nature. I mentioned you have male and female oysters. This is the unromantic part. They just spew their gametes out into the water, and that sperm has to find that egg, good luck, and then you have a fertilized egg. And that egg, under a microscope, you'll see it bloop into 2 and then 4. It's pretty cool. Within a day, what looked like a blob of cells is actually an animal that has 2 shells, and it swims around, and it has a stomach, and it has muscles, and it has to eat. And that will do that for about 2 weeks. This is how oysters get to new places. After 2 weeks, the awkward teenage years start, and they're going to go through metamorphosis. And so what they're going to do is, at that point, they're going to sink to the bottom, and they're going to test different areas to attach. If they find mud, they don't attach to that. They swim back up and get carried to the next place. They love oyster shells are a great thing for them to attach to. This is why you see oyster clusters, because they like to find oyster shells. In nature, that totally depends, but it could be 2 to 3 years before they're adult again, and then that cycle would repeat. So what does aquaculture do? Well, the hatchery takes all this and puts it under controlled conditions. And here's the great thing. In nature, it's not unusual that a female oyster has to produce 20 million eggs, because she's trying to just replace herself, if you think about it, evolutionary strategy. And so typically, you're producing 10, 20, 25 million eggs because the odds are so low that any egg will survive. You need to overwhelm it with numbers. And then larvae, good luck too, because they're microscopic. They're being eaten by everything. They're very fragile. So the hatchery's taking all that and trying to maximize that survival, which is nice when you start with 20 million eggs. The nursery is the next step, and then grow out and harvest. So let me just show you, oops, sorry, that happens when we turn on the sound on this. So this is, pardon this picture, but this is an oyster spawning. That's a boy. And so that is what they would do. They'd sit there looking like rocks that suddenly start leaking. And when they leak, the females do the same. And in shellfish aquaculture, I'll show you. I mean, that looks pretty sciencey, right? But we mix things in buckets from Lowe's. Like, that's how fancy this is, because we'll take the eggs and the sperm and mix them together, and we'll look for fertilized eggs. And this is what we want to see on day 2 through day 14 or so. We're looking for the larvae swimming around. So you can see the little shells here, and that's their little inside. They sort of look like hats, but that's what's helping them swim around in the water. They'll swim around. We put them in river water. We just take water from the coast, we bring it in, and we filter it so that we've taken out as much as we can of something that would compete with them or hurt them. And so they swim essentially in an ideal version of Oyster Bay or whatever your favorite body of water is. We do have to feed them for these 2 weeks. Because we've cleaned that water, we've taken out the food. So the food we grow, this is their salad bar. So this is Haley working there. Then these are bags of algae, and they're essentially being fed during that time, but they're being fed the algae that we grow. Okay. Remember that caterpillar to the butterfly? They go through metamorphosis. So then they're going to be seed, and seed would go into a nursery. And I'm really just trying to get them big, because we're going from something that's about the size of a grain of sand to something that a grower could typically use. And that could be something the size of your pinky or the size of your thumbnail. But you can see we're looking in the silos here. And while I'm looking in those, I don't know if you can tell that water in the silos is clearer than the water around the silos, because the water that we're pumping in has food. And then that food goes through those silos and out. And the oysters on the screen are getting a chance to eat. And so they take the oxygen and the food out of the water. And that's why it's clearer inside those than out. If you're going to grow oysters, you also have to sort oysters, because like grows better with like. So this is a lot of the time at the nursery. You have some type of grader where you're sorting them, and then they're going to go back into a nursery like that. But again, you are compensating for having a lot of oysters in one place by having a pump of water that's bringing them food and oxygen. So they get to snack and get some oxygen, and then that water's gone back into the water body, and you bring in more. So they're sort of snacking all the time. All right, grow out and harvest. So let me get that one going. That's, not all farms look like that, but that's pretty typical that you'd have something at the surface. These are floating. And so that's what a farm would look like, with the oysters being grown in these baskets. So for those who garden, if I'm growing oysters, I might fill one of these bags that Matt's lifting up. One of those bags, when they're thumbnail size, might have 5,000 oysters in it. But those oysters are going to double in size in a couple weeks. And so they're going to fill more and more of that bag, and they're going to start to crowd each other, and they're going to start to compete for food. That's a very low density because it's a research project, but I just wanted to show you what we do. We would take the oysters out, and you could then split them. So it's just like repotting, where you're taking something and you're just moving them to more bags. This is, again, where you can't cheat nature. You just have to give them more room to grow. So other than splitting, the other thing might be sorting them by size. So you saw that shaker table. Another variation on that is this, where you have some type of tube that the oysters are falling in at the end there, going down this tube, and they're falling through the holes. And so as a grower, you would take those and put like sizes back with like sizes, and you're hoping that the market sizes come out the end for you. And then I know Brian Rackley is here and is jealous that I have this system. One of your main challenges as a shellfish farmer, so it's kind of ironic, one of your challenges is that they grow fast, so you have to keep up with that. That's problematic, but it's good, but it's a problem you have to keep up with. The other issue that you have to keep up with is what we call biofouling, and that is all the other things in the water want to live on your bags and your oysters. And if they clog that mesh, then the oysters aren't going to get the oxygen and the food they need from the water. So these baskets went up. Those baskets are in the water. These baskets have been air dried. So what we do is we give them low tide. Every week we flip the baskets up. We take the baskets and the oysters in the baskets and let them see the sun. And then we'll come back a day later and flip them back like this. So the oysters and the bag are going back in the water. This is one way of controlling it. But air drying is nice because you're not using any hydrocarbons. You're not using any gas to power a power washer or anything like that. You're really essentially using solar power in its most basic form. All right. Okay, so I gave you the list of reasons that I love oysters. Why do I love oyster aquaculture? And I'll see if I can get you to agree with some of these. Well, one, you do get great food. I mentioned that my impression of Gulf oysters was, I will tell the story. Actually, in July, I interviewed at Auburn, and we went to a raw bar in Mobile, Alabama, and I ordered oysters, and my wife looked at me as a New Englander. She's like, "What are you doing eating Gulf oysters in the middle of summer?" I was like, "Got to try them." And I will tell you, they were some of the worst oysters I've ever had. When they came out, they had no salt. They were 7 different sizes. They were all different sizes on the plate. And when I picked up the oyster, because that's what I was used to doing, to tip it back, because I'm not a take it out and put it on a cracker guy, there was mud on the ice below that. None of that was appetizing. I got the job. We came back. We celebrated at the same raw bar in January, and I ordered oysters again. And I had some of the best oysters I've ever had. And what that showed me was that the wild can produce amazing quality, but it's not consistent. The shellfish farmers can produce a very consistent, beautiful shell and a very clean meat for people who want to eat those. And I would argue it's not a reef, but the farmer is putting oysters out on their farm every year. Reefs don't have oysters every year. They come and go. But farmers are stocking their farm with oysters, so you're getting some of those benefits. And if you put stuff in the water, anybody like fishing? You fish around structure, right? Oyster farmers put structure in the water, so it's probably not surprising that you get some fish living around the gear, right? And so whenever we bring these things up, we see fish, we see crabs, we see shrimp. It's clearly a very vibrant community that lives out there. And it does support those jobs in rural communities. It's not the same as fishing, but these are, you are working out on the water. Your livelihood depends on the tides. It depends on clean water. It looks a lot like what we used to do. And I'm not advocating for replacing it, but I do like the idea that our coastal communities have it as another thing that they can do as an opportunity. And yeah, it will help with this seafood deficit because remember, I think a lot of people said when you think of marine aquaculture, you think of salmon. I do too. I think of big salmon pens in Maine. But in fact, you can see that oysters and clams and some mussels, the shellfish in US, that dominates our marine aquaculture. That's really the way we can grow the industry to help with that seafood deficit. And then it is, again, that's my son, my younger son in the water there. It's culturally important. To me, we just did a celebration in Decatur at the Oyster South Landlocked, and the number of young farmers that I saw there that brought their babies along with them this year was just, It was great. That was really fantastic to me. It worries me if every shellfish farmer is my age and older. It's great to see young people making a go of it as shellfish farmers. And I'm going to show you this. If you haven't seen the Gospel of the Alabama
That's
Oyster,
just who we are, something on the water. We're all about the water. My great-granddad, I have a copy of his license he purchased in 1892 to catch oysters. We've done this for our boys, just to carry it on, you know? And I didn't see that happening in shrimping.
We was looking to diversify and try to spread out just besides doing shrimping. And I stepped off a Gulf boat and I stepped onto this oyster boat and into this oyster world. And there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences. I think the big difference is I'm home every night.
and I will tell you, as a marine biologist who came into this because I thought the science was cool, and then I thought the animals and the environmental effects were cool, and I thought the jobs were cool, I've discovered that this is why I care, is because I've seen people turn this into something that they do. So that gets me to the revolution chapter. So, the revolution, I mentioned to you, traditionally, when you think of Gulf oysters, you think of these wild-caught, bottom-harvested. It can produce beautiful oysters, but the quality varies, and yeah, that is a large man's hand, all right? That's Jules Melanson's hand. He was not a small man. And you can see it's a beautiful meat, but it's also covered in some mud and some mussels there. So that is, again, if you go to New Orleans, I think that's what a lot of people are expecting when they go to the raw bar. So as the guy from New England, most recently when we moved down to Alabama, I was sort of challenged by my bosses. Could we grow an oyster in warmer southern waters that could compete with what was coming out of cold water, and in a way that could make money? So it was a scientific question combined with a practical question. And so Dr. John Supan at LSU and I partnered up with Jules Melanson and Steve Crockett. So he's Point of Pines, and what is Jules' company was? Caminada Bay Oyster. He's passed away, and so that company is no longer there. But we partnered with them and those universities, and students and scientists came out, and we did find methods that could work. And to show you some of the products that came out of this, and I'm sorry, that should have said that's from Fernando de Silas. He took that picture. But we were producing oysters that I was completely proud of, and actually marched up to Cape Cod for an oyster conference they were doing up there and brought these oysters along to show all my New Englander friends like just how amazing these oysters could be. And you can see pearly white shell, clean meats. Again, not everyone likes oysters, but those are nice pictures to me. So all right, we did the science. We found out what gear worked. We found out what stocking densities worked. We found out how to control biofouling. So we could grow these oysters. But what we discovered is you need to sell these oysters to make money. And the problem was you could grow these beautiful oysters, but you were going to distributors in coastal towns along the Gulf Coast and along the southeast that are used to big oysters, and they're not used to somebody telling them what the price is. They're used to telling you what the price is. So we had a problem, because this takes money to grow these. You have to spend some time and money to grow these oysters. So what we did is we were lucky enough to start engaging. That's Ryan Pruitt of Pesh out at Murder Point. I'll get back to him. That's David Bancroft of Acre over in Auburn. They came down and they fell in love with these oysters. They couldn't believe how good they were. They loved what was coming out of this. And they started demanding that their suppliers get these oysters. Brian at Kimball House, he came down. He's one of 4 partners there. I think it's 5 now. But at the time it was 4. Brian came down, and he also loved this because he was getting amazing oysters from different parts of the country, and he was really thrilled to see that you could potentially be doing this from the South. So for those who like QR codes, and I know not everyone does, there is a beautiful article about this in the Bitter Southerner by an Oyster South board member, Jennifer Cornegay, if you want to check that out. There were some short films, some magazine stories, and then with Brian, Brian took that enthusiasm, and we talked about this, and we had the revolution sort of came together. I can't remember where the American Revolution came together. Was that Philadelphia? But the revolution really started at Kimball House, and I think that's appropriate to be at the Atlanta History Center. When we look back at what has started across this southern U.S. with oyster farming, Atlanta is key to that, because 2 things happened at this. These are growers from North Carolina around to, I think, Louisiana at the time. they started talking, so they found camaraderie. They found that they could share ideas because they weren't really competing. They're all producing different oysters, so they were happy to start sharing ideas. And Brian Kimballhouse was kind enough to bring in chefs from other restaurants in Atlanta to a Sunday afternoon where these growers got to meet them and show them their oysters, feed them their oysters. And that had this additional effect of creating enough demand that suddenly it was worth sending trucks up to Atlanta with these oysters. So this wouldn't work without that. Atlanta's embracing of this has been a huge part of the success. The revolution got organized in 2016. Oyster South is a nonprofit, and you can see there, really, it's not a growers organization. This is really built around providing sources for farmers, for communities, healthy waters, and good food. And so you can check out more about our mission there. But it has been a unique collaboration of chefs, shuckers, servers, media writers, and growers. The tagline is successful oyster farmers, healthy waters, and good food. And the two main things that we're known for at Oyster South is an annual industry symposium, which jumps around from different coastal states. And we typically have about 300 to 400 people there, about half of which are growers. And they're coming and sharing ideas with each other. It's really great. And then this is from this year, our annual fundraiser that some of you may know about. I think a lot of people call this Oyster South, but the actual fundraiser is Landlocked, and that is raising money for Oyster South. And you can see these are the growers, the bartenders, the chefs, all the folks. This isn't people who attended. These are the people who put it on. And you can see it has grown tremendously. And so I actually have B. Athena. Brooke is here, Brooke Rashid. She helps coordinate. She helps herd all these cats. And we're typically doing that every October, around the third weekend typically. So where are we at now? I'm going to wrap up here soon. I think there's some good, this is why I consider it a revolution. We now have, in 2009, there was no off-bottom farming in the Gulf of Mexico, and only a couple states on the southeast had it. Now, from Chesapeake Bay to Texas, every single state has modern off-bottom oyster farming in the water, with 400 shellfish permits and over 1,600 acres being grown. That means there are at least 20 million oysters that are being harvested every year from those. And you're getting all the economic and environmental benefits of those oysters by supporting that here. That's work supported by universities and our state Sea Grant programs. We have a lot of coordinated research. And then some of the brag points for Oyster South, some of the attendees. We've done seafood server trainings. We've gone to cities outside the South to help spread the gospel. And peer-to-peer is fun. We've supported sending farmers and shuckers and chefs to different parts of the country and the world to go learn from their peers. And then we've supported some other nonprofits like Shell to Shore and Minorities in Aquaculture. So I think I'm about here. Shellbound is a docu-series that Oyster South is partnering with Black Elk and the local Paladon. It's a 3-part docu-series that's premiering in December in New Orleans, and there will be screenings in cities, so I would be surprised if Atlanta weren't one of them next year. So this is fairly short, but I'll just give you a flavor of what we're looking to do.
They've got every bit as much complexity as wine.
A really pretty white, purple, bluish marmalade.
They're attractive and like tasty, they look good.
Juicy, plump, little salty, meaty pearls from the sea.
Oysters are pet rocks. They are these weird things that we're obsessing our lives over taking care of.
I think the vibe of a southern oyster is about, it's always a party.
It's a good story or a bad story, but everybody's got an oyster story. We love that. Man, I'm so glad I didn't wear that oyster shirt tonight. I could have easily done that. So I'll just end with what we can do. Like if this is something that calls to you, if you think this might be a love affair that you have as well, I know this sounds crazy, but just going out and supporting this by buying and eating and enjoying the oysters that are coming out of the region is a huge part of the success because that lets them survive and grow. Sea Grant occasionally comes under fire for funding loss, and so if you support state Sea Grant, they do very applied research. We would not have shellfish aquaculture in the Gulf of Mexico without the Sea Grant program support. Landlocked, the tickets go fast for that, so next year if you want to guarantee yourself tickets, you might want to look at sponsorships, and of course, joining and donating to Oyster South I think is another way that you can help. So I didn't want to run too long there, so I'll let that run in the background, because if you have drone footage, by law, you have to use it. But I'm glad to wrap up there, and I can take any questions.
the risk of raising an unpleasant topic, the CDC has recommended we all quit eating raw oysters because of the increased incidence of Vibrio infections.
So I don't know how you feel about unpasteurized juice or raw milk, or how you feel like what, as a consumer, that's a good question. Is that something that the government should say we can't do, or should that be a consumer's choice? Here's what I know as somebody who eats raw oysters. I mentioned that we have waters, that we've had a very strict set of rules about where you can harvest oysters from related to pollution. All right, we're good at that. We figured out where pollution is, so we can do that. The problem with Vibrio, this naturally occurring bacteria, is it's in what we call clean water. It's naturally occurring. So when you go down to the beach and you get like a little stick from a shrimp or a fish hook, you clean it out, because that Vibrio is in that water too, and that's what leads to some of those infections that you'll hear about. That means oysters have a little bit of that seawater in them when you eat them. And so your body, normally, if you are not immune compromised, normally your body defeats that, almost always. Almost all the illnesses that we see with Vibrio from the Gulf, for example, is from the one that is for immune compromised people. But it is very dangerous for those people. Certainly, choosing not to eat raw oysters is one option. My personal risk assessment is I don't eat oysters from people that I don't, if it's a restaurant that is doing an oyster special and they never do oysters, I'm not eating their oysters. If I want to know it's a place, it's a little bit like sushi. I want to know it's a place that routinely handles them, because what we've found, despite this revolution, and think about all these oysters being grown now over the last 15 years. Illnesses have gone down, believe it or not. Per serving, the risk per serving is lower. And the way we have controlled that is you can't make them safe without cooking them or processing them in some way, like irradiating them. But what you can do is you can put a very strict time limit from the minute that an oyster farmer takes that oyster out of the water, a very strict time limit about how long you have to get it cold. In Alabama, I remember in the summer, you had 1 hour from the time you took your first oyster out of the water, not the last. Your first oyster, the clock starts at, and you had to get it refrigerated within 1 hour, and then there's requirements about how cold it has to get. I treat it like a glass of milk. I drink milk, but if I've left it on the hood of my car in the sun, I don't drink that milk. And so if you came to my house and you pulled up in your truck and there were oysters in the back, not iced, I would not be eating those raw. So I think it makes sense to take some precautions with that. I think, again, a lot of the restaurants around here are very high quality. Atlanta's a great seafood town, and so you move a lot of seafood and you have a lot of people that are used to handling it. But I don't think it's clear yet. There's the concern that warmer temperatures will increase Vibrio, and I think that's possible, but I don't think the data are there yet to support that. But it's something, again, to be cautious about. And then I will say cooking takes that out. That solves that problem.
Can you talk about the fact that Georgia allowed harvesting this during the summer?
Yeah, so that was one of the main concerns was traditionally the way that government has tried to handle this risk is to not allow summer harvest. And so in the wild fishery, and there's two reasons for that. One is it helps control this risk because the temperatures are up at that time. So it's easier to let them get warm. The other reason is from a fisheries point of view, they are spawning. And so you want to let those animals spawn and then harvest them after they're done spawning. So you let them get through that reproductive period. For a farmer, they're providing their own seed, so you don't need them to spawn. You go to the hatchery every year. So the farmers in Georgia argued, look, with time temperature controls, we can manage the risk, and they have their names on it. So they're really motivated to manage that risk, right? And we're not part of the fishery, so it doesn't matter if we harvest these oysters before they reproduce.
One final question. I know that guy.
Fantastic presentation, thank you. My question really is focused on Georgia.
Okay.
And forgive my ignorance on this, but I believe that Georgia has a lottery system potentially open to farming and hatcheries, potentially limiting the amount of farming, or at least a hurdle to developing a new farm. So
there was a lottery for the leases that they issued.
the lottery, right.
The DNR was under this impression that because aquaculture had taken off around the rest of the Southeast, So the lottery was just something that I think was meant for them to sort of vet the people who were going to be getting into the business. But I mean, you know, it was kind of slow going to get people's interest because the way that they were setting it up from a legislative perspective was a little bit prohibitive.
So is the lottery still in place, and are there hurdles of growing?
There are still leases available in Georgia.
Okay.
And I'm not really sure what the application process is like. They've just kind of overcome that last hurdle, which is now farmers can do the summer harvest, so there might be some interest that is peaking. Some of the legislation was really good, and some of it was like a little bit tough. So I would expect to see, especially once you start seeing the stuff that's coming, like from the Tybee Island guys. I think that people are going to be really excited about Georgia oysters when they see how beautiful this stuff is.
Love it. Sign me up.
Great. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, everybody, for the questions. Thank you, Dr. Walton. I would like to ask Claire to come up and close us out for the evening.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Bill, Dr.
Pleasure.
Walton, for an incredible talk. We knew it was going to be excellent when we were with you last night, and you had so much to say. It's just fantastic.
Thank you.
We now have an oyster roast ahead of us, and wanted to let you know that with this oyster roast, we're going to have proper oysters, and we're also going to have crawfish étouffée. We're going to have red beans and rice, salad, gumbo, bread pudding. Making sure you all want to come. We're going to have crab, Bloody Marys, wine, etc. So we have a great amount of food there. And also we have a special treat in that Bill has agreed to demonstrate for us his, needless to say, superb mastery.
I didn't call it that. I can get them open.
Of shucking oysters. So I think that'll be a real treat to watch Bill shuck these oysters. And also, just a quick announcement, I wanted to let you all know that Cherokee Garden Library's spring program speaker is going to be Thomas Waltz, and he'll be speaking on April the 15th at 7 p.m., and we hope that you will save the date. And with that, let's all go right into the atrium and have a great time at this oyster roast.
And you want to do some pictures, right?
Yes.